the English countryside. Historic, full of trees, frequently moist. Whether by foot or by motor, traversing this green and pleasant land is one of life's simple pleasures. But when choosing to navigate this landscape, what vehicle do you pick?
You get yourself one of these. You already know what this car is. It's the Mazda MX-5. It's the quintessential two-seater, easily accessible sports car. Originally launched in the late 1980s, the Mazda MX-5 has been a staple. It's an icon, it's a legend, and it's been going for pretty much 40 years now, almost. The philosophy of the MX-5 is simple. It is a sports car. You've got a pretty much 50-50 weight distribution, you've got rear-wheel drive, and every generation of the MX-5 has been front-engined. It's not the most powerful thing in the world. Mazda MX-5s aren't supposed to be. It's about driving pleasure. It's a car that you can use every day as a fairly reliable commuter, but if you put it on a B road, it will sing. It's lightweight, you've got an awful lot of grip. And today I'm in the NC MX-5. As MX-5s go, this is probably the one that gets the most flack. It's a kind of black sheep of the MX-5 family. It's got this reputation as being heavier, boat-like in a way, compared to the NB and the NA. And I think that's an unfair reputation. I can understand why it has that reputation, because if you look at it, it does look a bit larger, and it is a bit larger than the NA and the NB. And it's a little bit more rounded, it's a little bit more bubbly. So if you look at it at first opinions, I can understand why you'd think, doesn't really correspond to the MX-5 philosophy. But on roads like this, where I'm not reversing to let Vauxhall drivers through, and you can put your foot down maybe a little bit, the MX-5's appeal becomes very, very clear. I have to tell you, dear viewer, that unfortunately I haven't really driven many cars like the MX-5. Typically, despite the fact that I've owned many cars, I think I'm on number 13 or something right now, I tend to like bigger cars, things that I can use as a practical daily, because I'm often moving around quite a few things or ferrying around people. So a two-seater Roadster sports car has never really appealed to me. I did briefly own an MG Midget, although I never got to drive it because it's an MG Midget and it didn't work. My brother has owned a Ford Street K8, which was absolutely brilliant and honestly kind of comparable to this. And if you have seen my first review, that was on the Nissan Micra K12 1.6 convertible, a car which I'd also like to say is vaguely similar to this in a way, and a car which I am going to talk about a little bit later in the review. It's a genuinely impressive little car. But right now I'm in a rear-wheel drive, proper kind of driver's car, and I'm very, very happy here. This is such a nice place to be. I've driven this thing, I'd probably say, for approximately an hour and a half, 2 hours now in total. And there's a few driving characteristics about it that I really like. This junction is absolutely terrible. So this NC MX-5 is the most powerful MX-5 really to date at the time of production. This is a 2007. It's an NC with the 2-litre engine, so you're chucking out approximately 160 brake horsepower. That might not seem like very much, and it's not, but bear in mind that this MX-5 only weighs about 1,100 kilograms. So it's a lightweight thing. Power to weight ratio is quite good. I've seen a lot of people put Lotus badges on their NA MX-5s for some reason, which I always thought was a bit silly, but driving one of these things, you can understand why people do it. I'm on a national speed limit road right now where I can really kind of test the car, and it's brilliant. It feels more than nippy enough. Obviously, being naturally aspirated, you've got this fairly linear power curve. It's very predictable. There's obviously no turbo, so there's no lag, and the engine really comes alive about above 3,000 RPM, and especially above 4,000 RPM as you really get into that power band. It never feels unpredictable. One thing that surprises me about this car is just how neutral the weight shift is. Obviously it's a 50-50 weight distribution, but being rear-wheel drive, I expected the rear end to be considerably more tail-happy. And at low speeds, if you dump the clutch to an extent, then you can kick the back end out. But once you're actually moving and you're above 20 miles per hour, say, or so, even when you're in that power band, you're at high RPMs and you're trying to disturb the car a little bit, the rear suspension, the rear axle remains absolutely planted. And what you do have in the NC MX-5, which you don't have in the NA and the NB, which are its predecessors, is multi-link rear suspension. So the back end feels essentially glued down to the floor, despite the fact that it's such a lightweight car. It's genuinely very, very impressive. 0 to 60 claims to be around 8 seconds, and that feels about right based on what I've driven. You do have in the NC, which I believe was optional in the NB and may have been absent in the NA, although I can't confirm or deny that, you do have traction control, which was apparently not in every single NC. And to be fair, I typically don't like traction control, and I don't think that you need it in a car like this because it's not excessively powerful. But if you're fairly unconfident with rear-wheel drive, then it makes an awful lot of sense to get an NC with traction control. It's not a bad system. I felt that lots of traction control systems are very, very strict, but this you can still have fun with the vehicle, and it is very easy to disable. You just press a button here under the steering wheel. Leads me to the interior, actually, to be fair. You'd think a Mazda MX-5, you know it's lightweight, you'd expect the interior to be relatively Spartan, but it's not. It's fairly nice in here. The materials are fine. I don't really want to sit around and discuss the interior of the MX-5 too much because it's not about that. It's a driver's car. For what it is, it's beyond adequate. Everything in here is quite nice. You can tell that everything's supposed to be lightweight. These sun visors are made of like very thin but sturdy plastic just to keep that weight down. The mirror is yet again plasticky, but everything that you're reasonably going to touch is quite pleasing. The gear shift in the MX-5, I'm not too sure about it really, and this is probably my main gripe with the car really, and feel free to disagree because I feel sacrilegious disrespecting the Mazda MX-5, but I feel that the gear shift on the NC, if anything, is a little bit too notchy. It feels like there's a little bit too much resistance. Don't get me wrong, it's the kind of thing you'd very easily get used to, and it feels precise. It's a very short shift, which I really like, but I don't know, perhaps I'm just being nitpicky, but around town, between first and second gear, it can feel like you almost have to fight against the gear stick to an extent to get it in, and I typically like a fairly light shifter. It's, of course, absolutely down to personal preference though. And the fact is that if this is one of the main criticisms I have about the NC MX-5, then it just goes to show what a perfectly composed roadster this thing is. You can get this MX-5, the NC, for fairly cheap now. These things are about £3,000 for an okay early one. And you're probably realistically going to be start looking towards the £6,000 mark for a really nicely sorted post-facelift NC MX-5. Now, what's important about the facelift on the MX-5? Well, this is a pre-facelift, just known as the NC1. There's an NC, a Mazda MX-5 Mark 3.5, which is typically the one to go for if you're interested in the NC. There's a slight facelift, but more so, the most important part is you've got a slightly revised interior, apparently better seats, and a slightly strengthened bottom end of the engine, with apparently a slightly higher red line, although I can't really confirm or deny that because this is a pre-facelift MX-5. Like I said, they get an awful lot of flack, but based on this, it's a fantastic car. There's someone reversing out of their driveway here, so we must be very careful. Don't want to crash this because it is not my car. Thank you to David for letting me borrow the Kai keys for today's review. It's roads like this, you don't even need to hustle the car and it's a pleasant place to be. Regarding refinement, vibration, spot on for what it is. You're obviously going to get a few vibrations because this is a convertible, but really, nothing too bad. Unfortunately, it's an incredibly windy, somewhat cold day, and in the interests of fashion, I've decided to wear this stunning flamingo shirt. Thanks to Elise for buying me that, by the way. But it does mean that if I do have the roof down, I'll freeze to death and you won't be able to hear me because this microphone is a little bit finicky at the best of times. And when I'm driving around in gale force winds, it will not be a positive auditory experience. But believe me when I say that when the roof is down on the MX-5, it's still refined, it's still strong, it's still stable, and it's a lovely, lovely place to be. Would I choose an MX-5 NC over the NA or the NB? Well, that's hard to say because, unfortunately, like I said, it's early days in the YouTube channel and I haven't been able to get my hands on an NA or an NB. If you do have one, by the way, and you'd like me to borrow your Kai keys, and you're vaguely in the Lancashire area, I can travel, but I don't have a car right now, then drop me a message, put something in the comments, and I would love to compare the NB or the NA to the NC. Because if the NA and the NB subscribe to this same philosophy, if they're a little bit lighter, if they're a little bit looser in the rear end due to the lack of multi-link rear suspension, then I can imagine it being an absolute hoot to drive, because this is brilliant. People say never meet your heroes, but honestly, if it's anything to go by, this is fantastic. It's such a composed, nicely handling car. Steering, the wheel is very responsive. It's heavier than I anticipated in regards to the steering, but the actual chassis of the car feels light, feels nimble, and it feels assured, very much assured. And the road today is wet. It was absolutely chucking it down last night, and I still feel like I can plant the car around every corner. It feels like it's almost on rails. I know that that's an overused phrase, but it's true. I think part of the reason that this car feels so good over bumps, around corners and everything, in addition to the rear suspension, is the fact that you do have an open differential. Now, it's kind of a double-edged sword with an open diff, because if you want to have fun, you know, drifting the car or whatever, an open diff is probably not for you, because if you try drifting, one of the wheels is going to have power, one of them's not, and you're going to end up dying and crashing off a cliff. But for normal driving, it's incredibly forgiving. You never really feel like you're at the limits of this car. You feel like it can go around everything, and if you are approaching those limits, you will hear and feel the rear tyres at those limits, and you never lose control. There's no such thing in this car as snap oversteer like there is in the Toyota MR2. That's just not something that I've been worried about. It's not something that I've been anywhere near close to approaching. So I think if you're in the market for a two-seater Roadster, if you've perhaps not owned a rear-wheel drive vehicle before, this is as good a place to start as any. Low-down torque is something which really impressed me with this car. The first time I got into it and I started driving it, I was impressed at just how much power you have lower down in the rev range. Typically with smaller engines, and I would still class a 2-litre engine with 160 brake horsepower as smaller, there's typically not much low down grunt, especially without a turbo, but this feels beyond adequate. It's a car that you can drive around town and it never feels outclassed. I genuinely don't get the hate. Perhaps I need to drive a 1.8 or a 1.6 version of an MX-5 to really understand the "you've got no power" kind of comments. I think that an awful lot of it too comes from people in countries like America, people who say the MX-5 is slow, where you've got a different car culture. The V8 is ubiquitous. Where your mother's Chevrolet Equinox has 330 brake horsepower, then admittedly an MX-5 might feel a little bit slow. But in a country such as this, such as merry old England, where we have roads made for horses and carts, a country where, just a rubbish country to be fair, with really shit roads. This is a car that excels on those. A car where you can't realistically go above 60 miles per hour. Because it's not about the power, it's about the handling. It's a lovely car. And thank you very much to David for letting me borrow this. I really genuinely appreciate it. Lovely. It has unfortunately begun raining. But never mind, because the MX-5 still feels sure-footed and planted in the wet. I said I've never driven any cars like this, and it's true, I haven't really. The closest thing to an MX-5 which I have driven is the Nissan Micra K12 convertible, which I reviewed in my first video. It's lovely. It's great fun. As I was saying, the Nissan Micra K12 C+C, which I reviewed in my first video, and you might think, Kai, that is the most ridiculous comparison. You're comparing an economy hatchback to a proper purpose-built two-seater Roadster. Yes, that's true. Yes, it is a little bit of a silly comparison. But, you know what? Driving this car has really made me truly appreciate how good and how much above its weight that Nissan Micra handles. It just puts a smile on your face, this car. You can feel those back tyres scrabbling, and the car kind of pivots around its back axle. It's fantastic. So anyway, the Nissan Micra K12, that has 50 kilograms or so extra weight in comparison to this. You've obviously got a far higher centre of gravity because it's based on a hatchback. You've got a much stronger weight distribution to the front. This is 50-50. The Micra, I'd assume, is probably about 65-35, and that's if I'm being very charitable because you sit very far up the front of the car. But in terms of driving fun, look, the MX-5 is better. But the Micra, for what it is, my God, it's so impressive. I posted a poll on the Kai Keys YouTube channel community page. You may have seen it, you may have voted. Thank you very much if you have. And essentially that questionnaire asked, which car do you think is going to be better? Do you think the MX-5 is going to be better, which I'm reviewing today, or do you think the K12 Micra C+C is going to be the better car? So, off the top of my head, roughly, I am paraphrasing from the actual results, approximately 75% of people said that they think the NC MX-5 will be the better car. So you'd naturally think that 25% of people would think that the Nissan Micra would be the better car than the MX-5. No, about 20% of people would prefer to walk, and about 5% of people think that the Nissan Micra would be the better car. For my thoughts on that car, please check the channel, give me a like and subscribe while you're at it, hint hint, and have a look at my review, because my God, that is such a weirdly composed, genuinely good car, and I think we made such a good choice when the time was right to purchase that car for my girlfriend as a commuter vehicle. And I think it genuinely does have its advantages over this. As a daily driver, I hate to say it because it feels absolutely wrong to say, but as a daily, the Micra K12 convertible is the better car. I just want to appreciate and enjoy the scenery, the road, and just the driving dynamics of this car. You can feel everything. You can feel exactly what each axle's doing. You know exactly where the rear axle is. You sit fairly close to the rear of the car, and because you're very down low in comparison to most other cars I've driven, you feel at one with the road. You feel very hunkered down. You can feel every single bump in the road, but it's not unpleasant to drive per se. This is a car that I could do long distances in. My God, I expected something a little bit more stripped back, a little bit more raw, but it's refined. So of course it's not a Grand Tourer. It's made for driving dynamics, but wow, Mazda aced it. They really did a good job. And I'd also love to drive some competition, such as the BMW Z3, the Z4, and see how they compete with the MX-5. If they're anywhere near as good, I will be very, very impressed. Absolutely gorgeous. What a fantastic vehicle. Things to watch out for on the NC MX-5. Unfortunately, like the NB MX-5 and the NA MX-5, the main killer on these things is rust. You'd think new generation of MX-5, it's a totally different body. It shares no parts except from what I've read, the front indicator on the non-US models is shared with the NB or something stupid like that. It's a new car. The chassis shares many, many similarities with the RX-8. I believe I'm right in saying it's essentially the same platform that the two are built on. Unfortunately, Mazda still didn't fix the rust issue, and despite the fact that the NC is a little bit newer, you're still going to suffer from it, which is a big shame. So if you're going to purchase one of these, for the love of God, look underneath it, look at the arches, look at everything. Regarding actually owning one of these to work on, turn into a track car if you want, do a few mods, supremely easy car to work on, and that's why people say that Miata is always the answer, because it is. It's the perfect car to learn the fundamentals of rear-wheel drive without crashing into a tree, because it's very responsive. You can really feel the limits of the car. It corners beautifully and you never feel like you're pushing the car too much. It's comfortable enough. Cabin room is fine. The boot is absolutely tiny, especially in comparison to the Micra, but that makes sense. One thing I noticed, and I was kind of skeptical about the MX-5, I was thinking 50-50 weight distribution, just how is that possible in a front engine rear wheel drive car? If you open the engine bay and you take a look at the engine, that engine is pushed right to the back of the car. You've got things in front of the engine like the coolant tank, as far as I can recall, which must push that weight further back. Obviously, the engine's right at the back of the bay, the engine's very, very heavy. You're bringing that all the way back and you essentially sit right in the middle of this car, and props to Mazda for doing that, because you'd think that a front engine car is objectively going to be more front biased, but it's not. They've done an incredible job. Something like the Porsche Boxster has a 50-50 weight distribution, but that's mid-engine, and that to me makes sense. Everything is towards the middle of the car. This isn't. This is the kind of car that is used as an introduction to sports cars, for track cars, and I can totally understand why. Fantastic vehicle. I feel like I'm singing the praises of the MX-5 too much, and I know that with a car review, you want me to be critical, you want me to point out things about the MX-5 NC that aren't particularly good, things that do need improving, but I've driven this for a while, and for what it's worth, I just cannot come up with anything genuinely bad. The fact that I've said that the gear stick is the worst feature of the car, the only thing that's annoyed me, if you want me to be really finicky, the doors are too high, like the window line's too high, but that's inevitable in the interest of safety. Compared to my MG, where the window felt like it was down here and that everyone could see your knees, yeah, it's too high, but it's a modern car, that's inevitable. It feels a little bit too bubbly, perhaps a little bit too closed in here, but yet again, it's a low car, you've got this low roof line. I am grasping at straws because it's such a nicely handling car. There's not much to it, it's simple. You don't have a lot of kit in here, but you have a pleasant enough interior. You don't have acres and acres of power, but you have more than enough. I genuinely can't criticise the thing. And I think value-wise, the fact that you can pick these things up for about £3,000, I mean, sure, you might have to budget a little bit in regards to repairs, servicing, MOT and everything if you get a cheaper example, but you can have such fun in one of these things. An NB, of course, you don't have as composed a rear suspension system. You don't have that multi-link that the NC has. But if you can get an NB for about £1,500, I mean, yeah, sure, it'll fail next year's MOT, but you've got some pretty fun transport there for a year for pretty dirt cheap. Regarding running costs on these things too, they are really not bad. You get approximately 35 miles to the gallon if you drive these things very, very carefully. Important question really, would I get an MX-5 NC or would I get the K12 Micra? You know what, this is going to be really controversial, but I think as a daily driver, the Micra makes the better car. It's fun, it's scrabbly in comparison to the MX-5, which feels composed and feels planted, but the K12 Micra, look, it's based on a hatchback. You've got 40 brake horsepower less, but because the limits are so easy to achieve in that car, you don't really feel it. The K12 Micra never actually feels down on power. The MX-5 doesn't either, but the driving style is different. Both of those cars actually, the MX-5 versus the Nissan Micra, indicate the fundamental differences between a front-wheel drive and a rear-wheel drive platform. Whilst the rear-wheel drive platform is a little bit more tail-happy and you can kick the rear end out if you really try, a front-engine front-wheel drive platform is never going to do that because you've got so much weight at the front. Those front tyres are really struggling because they've got to provide the acceleration and they've also got to provide the grip so you reach the limit significantly sooner. It's arguably a little bit more forgiving though. You can feel that limit, you can take your foot off the throttle and the car will make the corner, whereas if you do that in a rear-wheel drive car, you do risk oversteering into a tree. So whilst a rear-wheel drive car typically borders towards oversteer, which is where you end up in a bush, a front-wheel drive car will typically handle towards understeer, which is where you end up in a tree. You crash in both instances, but as I said in Top Gear, oversteer is more desirable because you can't see what you crash into, which is better. I don't know who decides let's go on a walk in the pouring rain, because it's horrible today. There's occasional breaks in it, but I wouldn't go for a walk today. I don't think I have a coat with a hood. Look at my wardrobe and it's just a collection of eccentric shirts. We are behind a tractor. We are having an excellent time. I'm just going to let him pass because, God, he was so far up my arse. It was ridiculous. I'll tell you what's also a really refined car for what it is in terms of driving fun, despite the fact that it's also front-wheel drive, and that's the Ford Street Car. That does, unfortunately, suffer from its engine. Whilst the engine in the K12 Micra, putting out 110 horsepower or so, feels alright, the Ford Street KA, you're only putting out around, I believe it was 95, 96 brake horsepower, and that does feel too low. It feels vaguely similar to this to drive, although you've obviously got that more upright driving position because it's based on a hatchback. And that's a car which is also worth a punt. If you can get one for about 700 quid, you know, drive it for a year or so. They don't rot out as bad as the original KA, actually, which does. If you see one with rust around the filler cap, walk away unless you've got a year's MOT on it, because it is jank. You know, it's terminal when they start doing that. Seems to be the problem with these lightweight two-seater Roadsters, really. Rust. It's a shame. I'm just thinking, is there anything else that I've not said about this car? But it's so simple. It's the essence of driving, essentially. This is... Just as the Volkswagen Golf is a car of all time, it is the epitome of a commuter vehicle. I think that the MX-5 is the sports car of all time. It's everything that a sports car should be. It's not excessively powerful. It's lightweight. It's got pretty much perfect weight distribution. It's rear-wheel drive, which is genuinely quite important. It's my main criticism of the other vehicles that I've mentioned today, which I've driven. It's a good car. It's a great car. And like I said, please, if you're in the area and you want me to give your car a little bit of a drive, let the world know what I think about it, then give me a little comment down below, let me know what you've got, and I will try and get back to you. I can't guarantee that I can or can't review it, because unfortunately I've got to faff around with insurance and that. It's early days, but I will do my best. At the very least, I read every comment, I respond to the vast majority of them so far, though in the future that might not be possible. And I really appreciate your support, I really appreciate your feedback, and let me know if you've owned one of these, and if you can compare this to any other car you've owned. Let's say you've owned perhaps a Z4 or a Z3 or an SLC. Let me know how the MX-5 stacked up, because I feel bad that I don't really have too much to compare it to. But maybe you do. Enlighten me in the comments below, please. I can see this car potentially being a little bit of an issue if you are taller. I am only 2'6", and it's not a tight fit. I can fit in this okay, but there's not really that much room behind me. I am reclined. I like to sit fairly reclined, and the rear of the seat is, that's as far back as it goes. So if you're over 6 foot or so, you're going to start pushing your knees up here, I can imagine, and it might potentially get a little bit uncomfortable. But it's kind of a fact with these cars, that's going to be somewhat inevitable. It's a small car. We are going to fuel up the MX-5. I've used about a quarter of a tank today, a little bit more, but I have had excellent fun in this thing. It's such a composed car. It's deceptively refined. I think the amount of power, could it do with a little bit more? Yeah, I'd like a little bit more, maybe about 180 horsepower or so, but 160 and this feels beyond adequate. It never feels like there's too little power. So I don't understand that MX-5 stereotype. Like I said, potentially in the NA 1.6, maybe even the 1.8, might feel a little bit outclassed, but the 2 litre, nice car, nice engine. Cannot criticise this. So there you have it. I can't truly criticise the MX-5 on anything significant. From its inception in the late 1980s, Mazda have remained true to their philosophy, at a time when so many other manufacturers have bloated, enlarged, and essentially mutilated their once nippy, lightweight models in the name of comfort and technology. Even with the NC, the most maligned MX-5, you still have a lightweight, rear-wheel drive car with 50-50 weight distribution with no compromises. Props to Mazda and long live the MX-5. Truly, Miata is always the answer.